At the height of the modern global economy, an economy measured in tens of trillions of dollars, something almost embarrassingly simple began to fail. Not a stock exchange, not a bank, not a semiconductor factory or a data center. Water. In late 2023, ships lined up at one of the most important trade arteries on Earth, waiting not because of war or sanctions, but because there wasn't enough fresh water to let them pass. At the same time, thousands of kilometers away in Europe's industrial heartland, barges on a river that once powered German prosperity were forced to carry only half their usual loads. Trade did not stop. It simply became slower, heavier, and far more expensive. And quietly, invisibly, that cost began to appear everywhere, on supermarket shelves, energy bills, factory balance sheets, and inflation statistics. How did something as ordinary as water levels become a new driver of global prices? How did we build an economic system so advanced and yet so fragile? And if this is happening now, what does it mean for the next decade? To understand why water has become one of the most underestimated forces in the global economy, we need to step back, away from charts and terminals, and look at the physical arteries that make globalization possible. Global trade does not move on spreadsheets. It moves through narrow, vulnerable corridors, canals, rivers, ports, and straits. Economists call them chokepoints. But for decades, they were treated as solved problems, pieces of 20th century infrastructure quietly doing their job in the background. The Panama Canal is one of those pieces. Opened in 1914, it shortened the journey between Asia and the Americas by weeks, reshaping global commerce. Instead of sailing around Cape Horn, ships could cross a 50-mile strip of land, lifted and lowered by locks that depend entirely on freshwater reservoirs fed by rain. That dependency was always known. It was just never priced. For most of its modern history, the canal handled around 36 transits per day. Container ships, grain carriers, LNG tankers, all flowing through on predictable schedules. Global supply chains came to assume that capacity is permanent. But in 2023, rainfall around Panama collapsed to historic lows. The reservoirs feeding the locks dropped. Each ship passage consumed millions of gallons of fresh water, and suddenly, the Canal Authority faced a choice that globalization had never fully prepared for. Protect water supplies, or keep the world moving, they cut capacity. Daily transits were slashed, first gradually, then sharply, from the mid-30s down to the low 20s. Ships began to queue for days, then weeks. Some operators paid premium fees or bid for priority slots. Others rerouted entirely, sending vessels thousands of miles around South America. Every option carried a cost. None of it stayed in Panama. A container delayed is not just a late delivery, it is capital tied up, inventory unavailable, contracts strained. A bulk carrier forced to sail around Cape Horn burns more fuel, requires more crew time, and delivers grain or coal weeks later than planned. LNG cargoes, already moving through tight markets, suddenly face logistical uncertainty, and those costs don't disappear. They move. They move from shipping lines to exporters, from exporters to manufacturers, from manufacturers to retailers, and finally to consumers. This is how logistics becomes inflation, not in headlines, but line by line, invoice by invoice. While the world focused on Panama, Europe was experiencing its own version of the same story, only quieter and older. The Rhine River is not a canal built by engineers. It is a river shaped by geography and centuries of commerce. It flows from the Swiss Alps through Germany and the Netherlands, connecting inland factories to global ports like Rotterdam. For Europe's largest economy, the Rhine is not optional. It is structural. Coal for power plants, chemicals for industry, fuel for refineries, raw materials for manufacturing. All of it moves on barges that rely on stable water levels. But as heat waves intensified and rainfall patterns shifted, the Rhine began to fall, sometimes to levels not seen in generations. When water drops, barges cannot load fully without risking grounding. The math is brutal and simple. You now need 2 ships instead of 1, 2 crews instead of 1, twice the scheduling complexity. Higher insurance risk, higher fuel consumption per unit of cargo. Transport costs surge, not because demand exploded, but because physics intervened. German industry felt it first. Chemical producers along the river reported logistical bottlenecks. Power utilities scrambled to secure fuel deliveries. Some factories slowed output, not because of labor shortages or weak demand, but because inputs could not arrive cheaply or reliably. Once again, trade did not collapse. It became inefficient. And inefficiency is inflation's quiet twin. This is where the story turns from infrastructure to incentives. Global supply chains were built for efficiency, not resilience. Over decades, companies optimized routes, inventories, and timing to minimize cost in stable conditions. Waterways were cheap, predictable, and carbon efficient. They became the backbone of globalization's promise. Lower prices through scale, but no one priced the risk of drought. Why would they? Rain was assumed, rivers were assumed, canal capacity was assumed. These were treated as constants in economic models. background variables, not strategic assets. When water became scarce, the system responded exactly as designed, by passing costs forward. Shipping companies imposed surcharges, ports adjusted fees, insurers raised premiums. Manufacturers revised forecasts. No single decision was malicious. Every actor responded rationally to protect margins. Collectively, the outcome was inflation without a villain. And this is why these crises are so difficult to fix. There is no single policy lever. No interest rate adjustment can make it rain. No stimulus package can raise river levels. Instead, what we are witnessing is the collision between climate reality and economic design. The effects extend far beyond Panama and Germany. In Asia, major rivers like the Yangtze and Mekong face similar stress, threatening industrial hubs and agricultural output. In the United States, the Mississippi, another critical artery, has already experienced low water disruptions that forced barges to reduce loads and raise transport costs for grain exports. Each event, on its own, looks manageable. Together, they form a pattern. Water is becoming a strategic constraint. This changes geopolitics. Countries that control resilient logistics corridors gain leverage. Those dependent on fragile waterways face higher costs and greater volatility. Trade routes once chosen purely for efficiency now carry climate risk premiums. It also changes politics at home. Rising prices provoke public anger, but the causes feel abstract. Consumers see inflation, but not drought-restricted canals. Governments face pressure to act, but solutions require long-term infrastructure investment rather than quick fixes. And so the burden falls unevenly. Large corporations with diversified logistics can absorb shocks. Small exporters cannot. Wealthier households adjust. Lower-income families feel price increases immediately. This is where the story becomes human. A European factory worker doesn't see the Rhine every day. But when shifts are cut because inputs arrive late, the connection becomes real. A family in Latin America does not follow canal transit statistics. But when food prices rise, the chain snaps into focus. Globalization promised abundance through connection. It delivered it until those connections began to strain under physical limits. The uncomfortable truth is that we built a global economy that assumed a stable climate, even as evidence mounted that stability was eroding. So what happens next? One path is denial, treating each disruption as temporary, waiting for rainfall to normalize, hoping markets adapt. This path leads to repeated shocks, persistent inflation pressure, and growing inequality between regions that can adapt and those that cannot. Another path is adaptation. That means treating water not as a background condition, but as strategic infrastructure. Investing in reservoir capacity, canal modernization, and river management. Rethinking logistics networks to reduce reliance on single choke points. Diversifying routes, even if they cost more upfront. It also means policy coordination, recognizing that climate resilience is not just environmental policy, but economic policy, trade policy, and inflation policy. Some countries are already moving. Canal authorities are revising long-term water strategies. Industries are reassessing where factories are built and how goods move. Insurers are repricing climate risk into logistics contracts. But these adjustments take time, and time is expensive. In the next decade, the world is likely to experience more, not fewer, water-related disruptions, not dramatic enough to halt trade, but persistent enough to keep prices elevated and planning uncertain. This is the new normal, a global economy constrained not by ambition or technology, but by natural limits we once ignored. And perhaps the most unsettling lesson is this. For all our sophistication, the foundations of prosperity remain physical. Ships need water, rivers need rain. And when those basics falter, no amount of financial engineering can fully compensate. The question is not whether water will shape the global economy. It already does. The real question is whether we are willing to redesign our systems, our trade routes, our policies, our assumptions, before scarcity forces the change upon us. Because in the end, inflation is not just a number. It is a signal. And right now it is telling a story about water. What makes this crisis especially dangerous is that it doesn't behave like the shocks economists are used to modeling. It doesn't arrive all at once. It doesn't trigger an obvious collapse. And it doesn't end when a single policy changes. Instead, it accumulates. Each drought season slightly reduces capacity. Each rerouted shipment adds marginal cost. Each surcharge becomes embedded in contracts. And over time, these small frictions harden into structural inflation. Economists sometimes describe inflation as a monetary phenomenon, driven by interest rates, money supply, or fiscal deficits. But logistics inflation works differently. It is physical, slow-moving, and stubborn. Once transport networks become less efficient, prices don't snap back easily, even if demand cools or rates rise. This is why water-driven disruptions are so difficult for central banks to fight. A rate hike cannot deepen a river. Quantitative tightening cannot refill a reservoir. Forward guidance does not increase rainfall. When shipping costs rise because vessels must carry lighter loads or take longer routes, those costs behave like a tax on the real economy. But unlike a tax, no government collects the revenue, and no legislature can easily repeal it. The burden is diffuse, spread across millions of transactions, invisible to most consumers. And that invisibility creates a political problem. When inflation rises due to supply-side constraints like logistics, voters still demand answers. Governments face pressure to do something, even when the root cause lies outside traditional policy tools. Subsidies, price controls, or fiscal support may soften the pain temporarily, but they do not fix the underlying constraint. In some cases, they make it worse. Price caps discourage investment. Subsidies mask scarcity signals. Short-term fixes delay long-term adaptation. Meanwhile, the physical system continues to degrade. This is where climate, economics, and geopolitics begin to intersect. As water stress intensifies, countries with control over resilient transport infrastructure gain quiet leverage. Canal authorities, port operators, and transit states become gatekeepers, not just of trade, but of price stability. Decisions that once looked technical, how many ships per day, how much draft to allow, which cargo gets priority, take on geopolitical weight. For energy markets, the implications are especially serious. Liquefied natural gas, coal, and refined fuels all depend heavily on maritime transport. When logistics become unpredictable, energy prices grow more volatile. That volatility feeds directly into electricity costs, industrial output, and household bills. In effect, water scarcity becomes an energy risk multiplier. The same applies to food. Grain exports rely on bulk carriers and river barges. When transport slows or costs spike, food importing countries, often poorer and more vulnerable, feel the impact first. What begins as a logistical constraint can quickly become a food security issue, especially in regions already exposed to climate stress. This is not hypothetical. It has happened before, in fragments, across different regions. What is new is the frequency and the simultaneity. Multiple waterways in different continents facing stress within the same decade. That overlap reduces the system's ability to absorb shocks. There is no easy alternative route when all major corridors are under pressure. Globalization was built on the assumption that when one route failed, another would compensate. Climate reality is challenging that assumption. And so the global economy enters a transitional phase, one where efficiency must be traded for resilience, and where cheap transport can no longer be taken for granted. This transition will not be smooth. Investments in infrastructure take years. Reconfiguring supply chains takes longer. Political consensus around climate adaptation is fragile and often delayed by short electoral cycles. In the meantime, households experience the symptoms before the diagnosis. Prices rise, services become less reliable, and trust in economic management erodes. If there is a lesson buried in falling water levels, it is this. Modern prosperity rests on systems that feel abstract until they fail. When they do, the consequences ripple outward, quietly, persistently, and unevenly. The challenge ahead is not merely to restore what was lost, but to acknowledge that the old assumptions no longer hold. Water is no longer just an environmental variable. It is an economic constraint, a geopolitical factor, and a defining force in the next chapter of globalization. And whether societies respond with foresight or denial will shape not just prices, but stability itself.